Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Catherine Panter-Brick, a medical anthropologist trained in human biology and the social sciences. She directs the program on conflict, resilience, and health at the MacMillan Center to engage with academics, practitioners, and policymakers who promote innovations in global health. Together with faculty at Yale, UNICEF, and other global partners, she works with the Early Childhood Peace Consortium to disseminate scientific knowledge on peace building and violence prevention. Professor Panter-Brick has directed more than 40 interdisciplinary projects worldwide, has written many scientific articles, and co-edited 7 books, including Pathways to Peace. Today we'll talk with Professor Panter-Brick about her new book, Medical Humanitarianism, Ethnographies of Practice. Welcome, Professor Panter-Brick.
Thank you for having me.
Certainly. Let's begin with your book. Please give us an overview of it.
So the book, Medical Humanitarianism, presents 12 case studies of humanitarian life. And it's framed with an introduction and a conclusion that shows the purpose and the scope of the book. And the purpose of the book is to give concrete insights into the practice of medical humanitarianism. And it's directed to 2 audiences, social scientists and humanitarian practitioners. And I think the readers of the book would be those who are curious about the intersection of medicine, human rights advocacy, international development, peace building, and humanitarianism. And also be readers who are interested in the power of ethnography, which is the systematic study of people and culture, in this case of humanitarian life, as told through a story. Okay. So the main point of the book is 12 very powerful stories about humanitarian life.
Okay. All right, we'll get to those 12 stories in a minute, but I think some of us don't know what the term medical humanitarianism means, so tell us a little bit about what that term means.
The term is defined as the biomedical, global health, epidemiological initiatives undertaken to save lives or alleviate suffering in crises born of conflict, disaster, or neglect. So there's 3 pieces to that definition. Okay. It's about health, it's about intervention, and it's about crises. And that's the gist of it. Okay. Why we focus on medical humanitarianism in particular is interesting. The humanitarianism is about the practice of care for people who are in great danger or distress. And medicine is about clinical practice and knowledge regarding health with humanitarian aspirations. So the 2 terms talk to each other. Okay. And it's true to say that humanitarianism has become increasingly professionalized and increasingly medicalized. So that's why it exists as a subfield.
Okay.
May I say also that medical humanitarianism is really a field of practice. It's about the people who practice humanitarian aid, who deliver the aid, and also the policymakers that organize the local and international delivery of aid. And it's also about a space of academic inquiry about the cultures and the systems that voice this humanitarian action. So a lot of books and articles have already been written with a fairly critical eye about the moral and the ethical dilemmas and the challenges and the unintended consequences of humanitarian action. So it's both a field of practice and a field of academic inquiry.
Okay. Very good. So how did the book come about?
So I wanted a book that would be a great book for teaching in anthropology in the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs. Okay. I wanted a book that would speak to the practice on the ground, had real experience. I wanted a book that wasn't sensational journalism, nor heavy jargon theory. I wanted a book that would expand the intellectual inquiry, but be very compassionate to the people who are taking very difficult decisions in very fraught environments, because it's very easy to be critical and alienate humanitarian workers in difficult situations. But you also have to be compassionate to the situation on the ground. And I found, or my co-editor found me, Sharon Abranovich, who wanted also to redefine the field. Together, we had a workshop in the University of Florida, where she is, and the university at Yale. We invited people who had stories to tell, who could write short, memorable, jargon-free stories that would speak about, that would invite social critique, but also would capture the moment, the fraught moment of a humanitarian challenge. And we then decided to frame the book in this comparative way of presenting the 12 stories side by side, to juxtapose them, so that the reader would be taken in by the depth of the case study, but also see the breadth of the themes that would arrive. So in my metaphor, it's like having the reader go through the wood and seeing as much as the forest as he or she does from an individual tree, to really understand the case study, but understand the bigger themes that arise.
Okay. And would you say that these 12 stories are best case practices exemplified, or do you also show some things that maybe they could have done something a little bit better?
No, I think there's no best approach. They really show conflict, real big dilemmas, tough situations, and either because of a humanitarian worker working in a particular situation, or the very difficult decisions that you can make, for instance, withdrawing from a country in conflict. So they're all about a particular story of a particular people in a moment of great difficulties, and they illuminate that situation. Okay,
let's get to the meat of it. Pick one of the stories and tell us about it. You know, I'm also interested in learning about the contributors and, of course, the lessons learned. So if you can pick one of the stories and go through it and tell us what the lesson was.
Maybe when we talk about lessons learned, I'll talk about some others. But, so I open up with chapter 1 that I wrote with a consultant who works for a local government and an NGO on the Afghan-Pakistan border areas. And it opens up with this, this head of a non-governmental organization that talks about the killing that has just happened on the road, on those border areas, where a van that was transporting NGO workers was overtaken by a motorcycle. The 2 riders pulled out a 5-year-old child and sprayed with the van with bullets, killing 1 man and 6 women. And they were all employed by the local government to distribute humanitarian aid. So it continues with some of the testimonies, not around this particular case, but several testimonies of people working in humanitarian settings in those fraught borders, caught in the forks of conflict. And it really shows the moral experience that happens for these local workers and how they are kind of facing every day the threat of kidnapping, the threat of killings, the threat of social ostracism, very difficult situation, and how they articulate their calling. And it makes for a chapter that focuses on human dignity and compassion rather than a chapter that focuses only on suffering and fear. And then it continues on to understand what the organization themselves can provide for these workers. And we're familiar with these symptoms of burnout, where you get basically burnt out by this humanitarian activity, and what people do to alleviate fear, to alleviate distress, and to find some kind of calmness in their lives. So that's the example of a moment that's both in the news. We've had in the news recently 2 bombings of MSF clinics. So it illustrates the danger of life, and the chapter is called Dignity Under Extreme Duress. So it's an extreme duress, extreme danger situation, but it shows a spirit of human dignity in articulating why you would want to continue with that work.
Right, very good. What about another of the contributors? Tell us about another
I could tell you of many different ones. I'll probably give you 2 vignettes. One of them...
I'm sorry to interrupt. So these are from countries all over the world, yes?
Yes, there are many in Africa, in Asia, Caribbean, and I forgot.
The Middle East?
Yes, that's right. Of course.
Yes. Okay.
And the Middle East one is Israel.
Okay. So give us another example.
Well, another example from Israel would be the balancing act that humanitarian workers have to do when they disperse medical aid to Israeli citizens, but also find themselves wanting to disperse medical aid to illegal migrants. So you have constantly to navigate a system whereby some are more deserving than others. So it shows the ethical and moral dilemmas of that. Another interesting chapter is about the doctors working for the British Army in Iraq and Afghanistan, who are doctors who therefore profess to save lives, but will also take a life in allegiance to the military. So it's about these contested ideals that you carry as a humanitarian worker in a specific situation.
Right, okay.
The trade-offs that you make.
Right, right. So it must be very difficult for people who work out in the field. Do you talk at all in the book about what a worker can do to try and stay positive about what they're doing?
Yeah, we have a whole section on that moral experience and understanding that in a deep way. We have other books that are, the other chapters, other stories that are much more critical, very critical. For instance, one by Tim Allen on the refugee camps in Uganda that shows that humanitarian workers are really working within bubbles of knowledge. They have camps themselves. They only interact during the day. They don't see what's going on during the night. They have their own idea of what is going on and what the reality is and what diseases are afflicting people. And so there's this dissonance between what's really happening on the ground and the humanitarian knowledge. So it's a deconstruction of knowledge. And that chapter is particularly critical, for instance.
And
so
I would imagine when you're teaching about this is something you can highlight and say, here's, suggest ways to get around that or improve upon it. I mean, how would you teach to that particular example?
So the point of the book, I think, is to let the story speak for itself.
Okay.
So in the example I gave you about the Afghan-Pakistan border, I think I tried to make the story as compassionate as possible. In the story I gave you about the Ugandan refugee camps, the story is as critical as possible. I try to steer middle ground between being critical and compassionate. I want an insight about the humanitarian field that is both. I don't want to invite so much critique as to invite paralysis about having no action happen or the ire of humanitarian workers. I don't want to be such a, have such an impulse of heroism and humanitarian action that have no critical reflection about what I'm doing. So it's a balancing act, but we don't say much except in the introduction and conclusion. We let the stories speak for themselves, and the idea is that you will just come out with this idea, yes, of course it's difficult, but that's not news. But they are specific areas to focus on in which you can be much more, have much more robust understanding of the situation on the ground.
Right, okay. So in terms of conclusions, what do you offer?
So the lessons or the conclusions?
Well, let's do lessons, I'm sorry.
So the lessons, I think I take away the lessons as understanding there's 4 things that I would want to teach about medical humanitarianism. One of them is about the grounding of that experience, what it's like in the minute of humanitarian action and what it means and how complex it can be and how human the stories are. Another one is about this knowledge, this idea of knowledge that we construct. So we are, for instance, in a situation of crisis. Let's say one of the chapters of the book talks about Niger and the food crisis. Now, do you define this as a medical crisis like MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders is doing, which means a medical and nutritional intervention, or you define that as a livelihood crisis, in which case you need food security and international development. So the way you call that crisis is contested, and that means the solutions that follow are very dependent on that knowledge.
Right.
Another, Alex Duval, for instance, asks us to understand patterns of violence, lethal violence, whether they're genocide or civil war or ethnic strife. The word you give to that crisis, whether you say it's an emergency or not, defines the solution. So the body of knowledge is actually very contested, and a lot of it is about the power of the person who speaks. So local voices are ignored, expert voices are called for. One of the lessons that I've learned is that we've often focused on the suffering of the beneficiaries and the safety of international expatriate workers, but we've sidelined these national humanitarian workers that work all their lives in one place. I've learned that knowledge is very contested. I've learned more about the ethical challenges that happen. One chapter in the book is about a small NGO in Sierra Leone that accepts students from Western institutions that come for short-term humanitarian missions and all the problematic, flexible, ethical events that happen in that wake with a lot of movement and transient movement.
Sure.
So everybody gets to be a humanitarian in that sense. So it's a very fluid and very contested kind of field. That's why it makes you think. And the picture of the book is about, shows both the emotion of suffering and the critical thinking that you need to do. So I like the subtitle, Ethnographies of Practice. It's about practice, but it's about through the telling of a story that you understand those lessons as they speak to you.
Right.
So it's the stories, or the lessons I go is that you can go from the very deeply personal story to a very political story and back again. And that tells you about the human and the social side of humanitarian life.
And it seems like it's extremely complicated.
It's complicated, but that doesn't invite paralysis either. The very wonderful thing happening is that that conversation happening between academics and practitioners. We have some examples of this at Yale. You know, humanitarians aren't paralyzed by complication. They have a mandate. It's how you define your mandate that allows you to act.
But I think it's important that they understand that it is kind of complicated in how you approach.
So I think the humanitarian actors are the ones who understand the best about the complexity of their case. But in the end, it is a humanitarian purpose. In the end, it's an act of caregiving. It's an act not an act of saving lives, but an act of caring for humanity. So that's medical practice in essence. But everybody involved in the field knows it's complicated. The main thing is to learn about lessons learned, of course. As I said before, the field is increasingly professionalized. So we teach about this, we train people about this, we're trained in the field through long-term experience. You learn on the job, so to speak. And then you come out with sometimes huge respect for the people who are living in danger, doing an imperfect job, but being there where it counts. So I come out with the other side, not throwing my hands in the air, but with immense respect, really, with what is happening on the ground. For many of the stories, there are some, obviously, which are not so noble, and others which are very much so.
Right. And conclusions.
So in conclusions, well, speaking as an anthropologist, I would say that what I've taken out is that I need more fluency in the languages of humanitarian life. And by that, I don't mean learning English and French or any other languages. I mean the technical language of the delivery of care, the administrative language of organizing international assistance, the financial language of the flows of money that govern action, the medical language about the interventions that happen. So I become much more multidimensional in my understanding of humanitarian practice, and I think that moves the field forward. So you build, like Russian dolls, you build a financial, administrative, medical, and technical aspect of humanitarian assistance. And I think also you learn to be very respectful of the practical concerns of humanitarian assistance, which is delivering aid where it needs to be done, or delivering assistance where it needs to be done. And very also casting the practice of humanitarian assistance with some critical, offering some critical insights about it. So the two really go together. It's a dance of, as I say, you know, understanding insights that give you a critical and compassionate understanding of the practice of humanitarian assistance.
Very good. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your work.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. For more information about Professor Panter-Brick and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.